Hey everyone, and welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking something incredibly complex, highly personal, and deeply fascinating. We're looking objectively at marital rights, contraception, and reproduction within classical Islamic law. To do this, we'll be pulling directly from two very different sources: a compilation of traditional Islamic fatwas regarding birth control, and a contemporary critical essay from a Substack called Nushas, which examines the systemic impact of these theological frameworks on women. Here is our roadmap for the day. We'll start off with the fertility dilemma, and then move into consent and contraception. After that, we'll look at nafaka and marital obligations, followed by a theology of reproduction. Finally, we'll wrap things up by examining what our source calls the fertility blind spot. All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the fertility dilemma. I want you to listen to this heartbreaking plea. It actually comes from an online fatwa, which is a formal ruling on Islamic law. A 40-year-old mother of four wrote in, asking, "Is it permissible for me to use contraception without my husband's consent in such a case where my doctor has also advised me against any further pregnancy?" She goes on to describe living with severe abuse, noting that her husband frequently threatens her while simultaneously demanding she have another child. She describes her past pregnancies as being so physically brutal that she needed a walking stick and had to be hospitalized on a drip. But despite her doctor explicitly advising against any more pregnancies due to her failing health, she still had to seek religious permission to use birth control simply because her husband refused to consent. That desperate plea forces us to ask a crucial, really defining question that echoes through both of our sources today. Who actually holds the ultimate authority over a woman's bodily autonomy and her fertility within this tradition? I mean, is it the woman? Is it her doctor? Her husband? Or is it centuries-old legal text? To really illustrate the massive human stakes behind that question, the contemporary Substack author shares a tragic medical story from her own mother's maternity clinic. It's the story of a woman named Samra. After enduring 8 absolutely exhausting pregnancies, Samra secretly had an IUD placed. Well, when her husband found out, he loudly protested that the doctor was stopping what Allah was giving them. Armed with local religious support, he literally forced the removal of the device. Just a year later, Samra died during her 9th delivery. The author points out that her community actually framed this fatal pregnancy as divine will, basically declaring her a martyr whose dead infant would drag her up to heaven. Let's move on to Section 2, consent and contraception. To understand the rules governing these deeply personal choices, we first need to define the legal architecture itself, which is known as fiqh. Within fiqh, the canonical foundation for birth control is called azl. This basically translates to coitus interruptus, or the withdrawal method, and it was a practice widely used by companions during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, because it was permitted back then, contraception itself is technically permissible in Islamic law. But, as our sources point out, the real question isn't just, is it permitted? It's permission for whom? So how do these legal rulings actually play out in practice? Well, according to the fatwa source, the fundamental principle is that both spouses have a mutual right to children. Therefore, a husband cannot use azl without his wife's permission. And crucially, a wife cannot use modern contraception like birth control pills or an IUD without her husband's permission. In fact, one fatwa flat out states that a wife is sinful for using birth control and lying about it to her husband. There's really only one widely accepted exception, and that's severe obvious harm. And we aren't just talking about being tired or overwhelmed. It has to be definitively certified by trustworthy doctors that a pregnancy would cause severe physical damage. All right, let's look at Section 3, nafaka and marital obligations. Classical texts across all 4 major Sunni schools of thought, Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, and Hanbali, outline a foundational legal concept called nafaka. In short, this term defines the husband's strict financial obligations to his wife under the law. And this brings us to a really stark contrast presented by the Substack critique. Legally speaking, nafaka includes providing food, shelter, and clothing that's appropriate to the wife's social station. The classical jurists were incredibly detailed about this, noting everything from the size of the dwelling to the quality of the food. But the author points out a glaring omission. Historically, nafaka completely excludes maternal health care. The classical framework does not mandate the husband to pay for prenatal care or medication for gestational issues. So the critique argues that while the husband is legally bound to fund basic subsistence, he is not obligated to fund the medical repair and health care of the very body that is actually producing his children. This perfectly transitions us to Section 4, a theology of reproduction. The Substack author traces this dynamic back to a foundational hadith, which is a recorded saying of the Prophet Muhammad. As the story goes, a man asked if he should marry a beautiful woman of good lineage who could not bear children. The Prophet explicitly instructed him not to. Instead, he commanded, "Marry the childbearing, the loving, for I will be proud of your numbers before the nations on the day of judgment." The source argues that this establishes a theology where a woman's primary value proposition is heavily tied to being young, fertile, and capable of producing maximum numbers for the faith. The author critically analyzes this theology by comparing it to an economic logistics model. In this framework, the husband represents the capital. He's the provider of basic subsistence, the nafaka. The wife is the labor, the producer. And the children? They are the output, the ultimate goal to increase numbers. The author argues that within this system, polygyny, or having multiple wives, is simply a way to solve a throughput problem. Since a woman can literally only carry one pregnancy at a time, adding more wives simply adds more units of labor to maximize that reproductive output. Meanwhile, fatherhood remains primarily a financial category rather than a caregiving one. Which brings us to our final section, the fertility blind spot. Both of our sources point out a massive asymmetry here. On one side, you have intense female fertility demands. There are explicit religious commands to select young, fertile women who owe their husband's bodily availability. But on the flip side, there is a total absence of a male fertility framework. The critique notes there are absolutely no equivalent instructions in the tradition for a woman to assess a prospective husband's reproductive capacity. Nor is there a legal framework holding men accountable for childless marriages. To really illustrate this blind spot, the author points to a historical case from Sahih Bukhari involving a man named Abdurrahman. His wife came to the Prophet visibly bruised, claiming her husband was physically abusive and entirely impotent. The husband completely denied the impotence, pointing to his 2 sons from a previous marriage as proof. And the results? The Prophet looked at the boys, noted their resemblance, and completely dismissed the wife's claim. The Substack author highlights a critical takeaway here. This historical ruling assumed a man's past fertility guaranteed his present potency, completely dismissing the woman's direct testimony about her own lived reality and physical abuse. We conclude the author's structural critique with this incredibly powerful, albeit heavy summary. The theology built a martyrdom category for the women it kills. It built no recovery category for the women it leaves damaged. This really encapsulates the author's view of a system that honors maternal death, like Samra's, as sacred and divine, but allegedly fails to legally protect or mandate medical care for maternal survival. As we wrap up this explainer, we're left looking at a profound friction. We've seen how rules designed centuries ago regarding consent, financial obligation, and reproductive duty continue to operate today. We see it in modern fatwas and in the tragic medical outcomes detailed in our sources. So, what happens when ancient theological frameworks of fertility collide head-on with the realities of modern maternal healthcare? How do individuals navigate systems that demand so much of their bodies? It's definitely a lot to think about. Thank you so much for joining me to explore this complex material today, and I'll see you next time.